Mānawa mai e te pūtanga o Matariki, mānawa mai e te ariki o te rangi, mānawa mai e te mātahi o te tau. Whānau, hara mai te toki a te huakirangi, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Mō tēnā tātou te whānau, kua tai mai nei runga i tēnei kaupapa harikoa, kaupapa ngahau, kaupapa tākaro anō hoki, tuatahi ake, me mihi atu ki a rātou, kua haere ki tua o te arai oki rā, i tō moinga roa, ka tuku tō mātou aroha ki te whānau whānui o Takutai Tash Kemp, moi mai rā e kui. Welcome e te whānau to our second toi ako in a series of webinar for this year. Ko waio, ko Nikki Penetito-Hemara tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no Ngāti Ranginui, Ngāti Kahungunu, te whakatōhia me Ngāti Porou. My whānau hail from the tribes predominantly on the east coast of the North Island in Aotearoa here in New Zealand. So yes, I'll be your host today, and I'm excited to introduce you to our kai kōrero. But before we do, there's some online tikanga to quickly explain. I see there's people gathering in our chat at the moment. So the chat whānau is one of the Zoom tools that we've got open, and that is open for any general comments. Please feel free to share your thoughts, your kōrero. Also, to kick off some virtual whakawhanaungatanga, please introduce yourself in the chat. Ko wai koe, nohia koe, who are you, from where do you descend, and where are you beaming in from today? That'll be awesome. And then the other tool that we've got is the question and answer forum for our pātai, and there'll be space today to be able to field some questions from you guys as an audience. Hariata's looking forward to that part. Other than that, there's just a big mihi. I'm aware that we've got some whānau who are beaming in from our global audience, given Hata's done some mahi overseas. And so, yeah, just really excited to share. But before we do, I'll introduce our kai kōrero for you and give you a little bit of an overview of the webinar today, and then I'll hand it over to our kai kōrero. So today we welcome Dr. Hariata tai Rakena, he uri no Ngāti Hauā, Ngāti Māhanga ki Waikato Tainui. Hariata is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for Indigenous Health at Johns Hopkins University, where she completed her PhD in public health, specialising in social behavioural approaches to global health. As a Fulbright New Zealand scholar, she now has over a decade of experience in the international Indigenous public health sector, where she has expanded her professional experience to Canada, Australia, Sweden, and most recently to the United States. Hariata started her career in public health as one of the first toi tangata interns in 2013, 2014, and later as one of our leading kaimahi. So welcome back, Hariata. And now she's back to share all her experiences and mātauranga from her journey. In terms of an overview of the webinar today, Dr. Tai Rakena will share her recent doctoral dissertation research on Indigenous joy that collaborated with an Ojibwe land-based cultural immersion camp for Rangatahi in northern Minnesota in the States. Hariata will discuss the findings from her study that explored what joy experiences are like to the Indigenous kaumātua, kaiako, rangatahi, and whānau involved. She will also discuss the cultural exchange research experience with the Ojibwe community at the Fond du Lac reservation. And she will also draw on connections demonstrating the importance of joy meaningfully incorporated into health and educational programs and what that might look like in terms of Māori applications in Aotearoa. Nau mai, hara mai, Dr. Hariata tai Rakena, ka whiua te rākau ki a koe hoa.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Bonjour and greetings. It's very exciting to be here today. I'm just moving some boxes around so I can see some of the chat flow through, and I can see some little windows as well. So tēnā koutou. That was a really generous introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm really excited to share about this recent mahi. This is fresh off the press. I just submitted this in April, defended at this time, and graduated in May. So this is the first public time that we've been able to share about it. I'm really excited. But first I will ground myself in this work. So, I te timatanga māku e mihi atu kia koutou ki toi tangata kia ku hoa mahi aku hoa maurua tēnā koutou mo tō pōwhiritia mai au I tēnei rā. Ki te hunga mātakitaki a ipurangi nei ki ngā tōpito katoa o Aotearoa o te ao, tēnā koutou. Ki te haukainga o tēnei rohe ki ngā Piscataway, ngā Susquehannock o Baltimore I Maryland, tēnā koutou. Anō nei ki ngā Anishinaabe, ki ngā Ojibwe o Minnesota, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko wai tēnei, ai he uri o Waikato o Tainui Waka, o Pirongia o Taupiri Maunga, o Waikato Awa, o Ngāti Haua, o Ngāti Mahanga Hapu. Ara no Aramiro no Rukumoana Marae hoki, ko Hariata tai Rakena. Oh, ko tākuta Hariata tai Rakena tōku nei ingoa, tēnā rā tātou. Tēnā māku e whakawhiti ki te rātu reo, ki te reo Ojibwe Moen. Bonjour, Indinoe mā Ginadug. Hariata tai Rakena, Indigenous, Ngāti Haua, Ngāti Mahanga Indodem, Waikato, Tainui, Indunjaba, Chi Miigwech. So these are the worldviews that orientate this work. And I have stepped into this encompassing my unique positionality and intersectional identities with respect and pride. And I'm excited to welcome you all today. No mai and bonjour. Bonjour is how you greet people in Ojibwe Moan, in the language of the Ojibwe people. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, here is a bit of an outline of what you can expect from the presentation. I will begin by describing the point, the why behind this. What was the research rationale, what had been done previously, and contextualize this in a broader research context. And then I'll describe the actual study design. We'll go into specific detail of actually just two of what was three aims in the dissertation, which really gathered around joy itself. And then finally, I'll have some conclusions. We'll talk about kind of what it means, what iwi Māori, what kaimahi Māori could possibly draw from this, and what we can learn from looking further afield in te ao hurihuri in the broader global context when we engage with other iwi taketake or other Indigenous folks. So if you ever get lost, you'll be able to see on the top that there are a number of sections, 1 through 5, and I've kind of indicated where we are as we go along. So let's get into it. So what we know from the cultural revitalization literature or the academic space is that culture is medicine. It's healing, restoration, solution, intervention, and it is well-being in many forms. So powerful examples of Indigenous-led programs or health curriculum can look like things like language learning, revitalization programs, and the planting of traditional foods such as marakai. And comprehensive social and natural environments that actually facilitate cultural efficacy can really positively impact well-being. In the growing body of cultural measurement, so measuring things in the academic space, it calls for an increase of culturally pertinent measurement development. So this actually requires a bunch of formative research to get to a conceptualization of these really complex constructs, such as understanding a cultural protective factor. You can't just go in and jump in, you need to understand what's happening from underneath. So this is what is required to allow us to deepen our understanding of the mechanisms or the reasons why Indigenous culture can confer or can help promote well-being. And just a note, like we know for our own iwi Māori, well-being is not just one construct. There's not one way to describe it across all sorts of groups, but there are some aspects that are really universal across different bodies of literature. And that is that they have multiple components. Some can be social, emotional, spiritual, for example, and that it's actually the sum of all these parts that are greater than themselves. So looking at research with Indigenous peoples, Western public health research, and the practice that has been taking part can gain really valuable insight towards health promotion if the relationship with community partners is relational in nature, and that the tino rangatiratanga, the self-determination of these folks are actually upheld within that relationship. They incorporate the knowledge systems or the mātauranga, the language, and the practices, tikanga and kawa, of that community involved. And culturally grounded research is an approach that utilizes and seeks to actually enhance these inherent strengths that might already be a part of this community's framework. So we're looking to amplify what already exists. And so this serves as a really helpful and viable pathway away from a reliance on surface level cultural adaptation that has happened in the past to apply evidence-based initiatives with Indigenous communities, as they're no longer acceptable or sufficient. And so from a historical perspective, some strengths-based approaches to research can also serve to counter a legacy of problematic academic research that was on rather than research with Indigenous communities. And so now the subject of the day, joy itself, is really drawing from a positive psychology academic space. And in this realm, joy is really considered a universally experienced positive emotion. And there's a whole spectrum of joy, actually. There are ways in which joy can be felt in a peaceful, serene way, a sense of calm, being comfortable in oneself and actually at rest. And then there are like the other side of joy, the other components that can be like really high energy, excited, other forms. So joy is actually on a spectrum. And what we know is that it has multiple like positive benefits for our health and well-being that are physiological, that are cognitive, or for the mental health space, and they're social. The majority of joy experiences are actually in the company of others. We experience this in a social setting. And then there are actually some constructs or some other emotions or some other experiences that positively reinforce joy, and gratitude is an example. And up until the day that this research was undertaken, the majority of joy research had been done in Western countries and with white individualistic populations. So there was really, really little work that had been done with Indigenous communities, for example, but other peoples of color. So there's a big gap, there's a big area in which we could explore this. There's some things that we knew, we were kind of stepping into this with an idea, and there are lots of things that we were hoping to find along the way. So that called for our research, our study, that was in partnership with this community. Like I said, it was on the Fond du Lac reservation. But what I will be referring to it from now on is a Gidar camp, and that is short for Gidar Kimina Wigamit, which means our Earth Lodge in Ojibwe Moan, or the Ojibwe language. You'll see a number of like beautiful pictures here. And I will just note that because of IRB, or the ethical rationale, I cannot share any faces of any of the people I work with, which is a shame, but I am trying to share as much of the activities, the nature that were a part of this partnership. But here is Gidar. It's based in northern Minnesota, which is really close to the border with Canada, a community that I got to be a part of for quite some time. And some parts that are specific to this camp in particular is that they're trying to hit kind of multiple levels at one time. And so it's a cultural base camp, it's a land-based camp, it's a science camp. And it was originally created almost 30 years ago by two elders or grandmothers, who are referred to as the Gidar grandmas, actually. They were educators themselves, involved at multiple levels at like school board and then statewide educational advisors across their career. They saw that there was this gap between what the Rangatahi, or the youth in their community, were experiencing and what the educational outcomes were requiring of them. And so many of them weren't getting past 7th grade, which is kind of like intermediate level. And at the time, there was some funding to try and get these Indigenous youth into higher education, into trades training programs. But these grandmas were like, hey, wait up. These kids aren't getting past 7th grade. We've got a little bit of work to get them through there. And so what it actually looks like on like a well, not really a day-to-day process, but what it looks like for community is in their school year, which starts in September, there's one monthly weekend-long Wānanga or camp where it's a stay away type thing. We'd go to this area. I'm going to refer to it in some settings like the precinct or the marae. They'd stay there, and this happened every month except for December because it's a busy time with the holidays, and then through to the summer, and then they do some week-long summer camps. And every single camp, there are different activities that are happening. There are seasonally dependent things that go on according to what is important for Ojibwe at each marker of the year. There are science and math teachers who come and share different projects themselves, and there are art-based things. There are a whole bunch of things that make a really jam-packed weekend. And as I said, I've been involved with this for quite some time. I'm just realizing that fall is not really like a helpful measure for folks back home. But from about September in 2023, I started to get into relationship, have some kōrero with folks from this community. And from November onwards, I attended every single camp for about a year and a half. And so what you'll see is this kind of timeline with quite a big gap at the beginning, because we really wanted to find ways to engage with community, to build a relationship and get an understanding of what they would actually like from this research. Sorry about that, some people outside. We wanted to get an understanding of what would be helpful for community in this process as well, which ended up being some evaluation, which was one of the study aims. So they wanted to understand, like, what was the ngako, what was the reason why community members have been involved with this project for almost 30 years, for multiple generations now. Folks are bringing their children in. And what are ways that we could engage in a research partnership that was sharing our mana, and that we could learn and demonstrate at the same time what it's like to be in cultural exchange, what it's like to show these young people what research can look like, rather than, I guess, just a lab-based understanding of research. So there were 3 components. There were some interviews that took place that started in August. There were some listening sessions, which is kind of like a focus group or a group discussion. And then there were some group model building activities, and those are kind of the 3 main aims that were part of the study. And what we were looking at doing, what the point was, or the objective, the whānau here, was to explore Indigenous joy as a protective health outcome that would be activated, so something that you can engage with by going to a cultural immersion camp like Gita. So trying to understand what are the ways, what are the mechanisms, so what are the pathways that activate this thing. And as I said, there were some specific aims. I'm going to be talking about aim 2 and aim 3 today, not so much about aim 1, but I just would like to show you that there are multiple things that were going on, and we were looking at joy from different perspectives within each aim. So the first kind of group thing, or the joy-related thing, were these listening sessions. And what that looked like was actually kind of a marrying of what's happening at the Wānanga, what's involved with camp already, and then finding a way to have some kōrero or some discussions and some Wānanga about what does that mean, what do the activities mean, and how can we get understandings of joy within that. So what that technically looked like was at 3 camps, at September, October, and November camp in 2024. We had this connection, so we had an engagement with an activity, and then we had a discussion with it. Every time there were different kind of makeups of groups that engaged in the conversation. We usually had 2 conversations at each time, and there were between 7 and about 12 people who are involved. And we really tried to get a mixture of different generations each time to see if we could elicit different thinking, different conversations because of that. There's a little bit about the analysis process from a research perspective that we can get into more detail in the Q&A if folks are interested, but this is, I guess, the formal process that we followed. All right, so I want to describe one of the camps so you can get a better picture of what was going on. And this one, Manomanake, or wild rice processing, is actually one of the most important mahinga kai activities for these folks. And so I really want to highlight this. So for them, they are a lake-based group of people, or iwi. A lot of what they do is revolving around lakes, and there's a type of rice that's actually high in protein and closely related to a nut that they would harvest each year at the end of summer. So it's really important. It's a main staple in their diet, and it's one of the practices that they've been able to maintain throughout interaction with non-Indigenous people. And so here are some of the different processes that went on. What happened is actually at the beginning of the day on the Friday night, we had some PhD students come share about water quality, how to measure that, what that looks like, different instruments you could use to engage with that, and had some kind of scientific coho about manomanake, about wild rice. The next day in the morning, we had a little bit of a hui with some kaumātua, some elders came along, and some knowledge holders engaged with some drumming, something that you may have seen if you've ever seen a powwow of sorts. So some drumming, some singing, and they shared some of the kōrero, the pūrako, and the tikanga around manomanake. So they shared some of the reasons, the stories, the rationale as to why this thing is so important, and to help youth get an understanding of their responsibility to maintain that relationship with wild rice. From then on, they kind of got to engage in many of these stations. And so there was a station that was looking at the scientific properties of the grain itself. We had some microscopes. I was about to say stethoscope. So microscopes. And then there were three main processes which they would have done traditionally to push the rice from its hull, to remove it, to then also make it able to be preserved. And then we did some tasting of different forms of rice. So this was an example of an activity that we would do. And then later on, we would have a discussion. We'd get groups together to kind of discuss what was the point of this? What did it feel like? How were some emotions experienced? Who was involved with that? And the main findings that we got from this work actually will separate into two areas. So there are 6 key joy findings that match what we see in the literature, what we see in academic spaces already. And then there are some other findings that are uniquely Indigenous. And what I want to do here and really highlight is what is valuable about this is the first time that Indigenous concepts of joy have been discussed, or examples of them, in something that matches what we see in the world. And so there are 6 here that are highlighted in this work. And what I'm going to talk about in kind of synchronization is number 3 and 5. Creativity and flow is something that we observed at camp every single time. And what we learned through this process is creative projects, creative activities allowed for people to kind of decompress from what they were doing. Sometimes it was beading, creating beautiful works like this. Sometimes it was painting. There were different types of activities, but being able to do this allowed all sorts of folks, not just the youth, to get into flow, to feel this kind of sense of euphoria, not being so stuck in their mind, and not overthinking, being able to just engage in an activity. And so I want to highlight this quote that one of the youth shared about this, and it actually encapsulates both sides of this creativity and flow. So they said, what I think of when I hear joy is like art or painting, because sometimes somebody can be the quietest person, but also the happiest person through their art. What I thought was really beautiful about this is that sometimes joy or high energy activities kind of take over our understanding of this activity or this feeling. But for this youth, they kind of like came out with this idea straight off. And I thought it was a really beautiful depiction of the serene or kind of more calm joy. And now turning over to Indigenous joy, there were 5 main findings that kept coming up that were pretty unique from the others that we've highlighted. And what I'm going to talk about in more detail is 3 of them, but solid experiences, food sovereignty, community, humor, and upholding traditions. And I've got to say, many of these we kind of expected, actually. We expected something along these lines to come up. None of them were particularly surprising, but it's something that I had seen, I got to experience from spending almost a year with these folks, myself at home with my whānau, across the world. These are things that I have seen in lots of spaces. So having this data emerge or having people talk about it was really beautiful. And so I'm going to share about these 3. Solid experiences was probably one of the most profound and new ways. I haven't thought about this before, but one of the adult kaimahi shared about how for them engaging with their mahinga kai, their traditional tākoro, was a way for them to feel something solid. It was something that would give them feedback or have an experience that was tangible. For instance, they talked about a specific example of going to catch their first kill, going hunting for the first time. This enabled them to not only feed their whānau, feed the local community, feed elders around the space, but it also was something that they could retain. And then they kind of contrasted this to the idea of more contemporary forms like social media, that you could post something and get a sense of a dopamine hit in that, but it could get deleted or you could be censored and then it would just fall through the fingers like sand. So this was an idea of solid experiences. Food sovereignty was another subject that I wouldn't say was surprising, but what I did find really interesting about this is it didn't matter if they were very, very young tamariki or children, didn't matter if they were a youth almost finishing high school, adults or elders, they were all able to really readily discuss examples of food sovereignty that might be going out to get kai, it might be cooking kai, it might be experiencing with others, it might be learning about it, but they were all able to name different aspects that gave them joy. And I thought this was really poignant and specifically in being able to demonstrate how we have an understanding of what's important to us. And then lastly, humor. This is something that's actually really not discussed enough, and it was something that I've experienced and I was really excited to have this come up, and I had to kind of keep my cool at the time because it was very, very exciting. And this is one quote from these folks that I will get into for now. So it's that Indigenous humor, man. That is my Indigenous joy. Sitting around the drum group with the bros or sitting around people that just get it. You know, we all get it. We all just connect and laugh about it in a good way. We feel just so good that next day, you know, after having them gut-wrenching, stomach-cramping laughs. You just can't beat that. And I just thought it was a beautiful illustration of what we were looking for. So from these listening sessions, there were quite a few take-home messages. I'm happy to share these slides up. I won't go into too much detail. But lots of what we found is that this research as well supports what's already in the literature, but it's unique because it's with Indigenous people. There are some specific ways that having joy involved with some programs could reduce things like loneliness that is a really strong epidemic in places like the United States right now. Joy is something that strengthens social bonds and a sense of belonging across generations, which is a valuable thing as well. I'm going to go into the group model building aspect and what that project was itself. This is a type of method that comes from systems dynamics, which is a really valuable way to look at something in its entirety. So what we did is we engaged in 3 activities. 2 were at Wānanga, or the camp that was in January, and then 1 was in February to allow us a bit of a follow-up session. And most of the crux or the important part about group model building is the back and forth, the going and starting something, having a conversation, being creative, and then trying to figure out what does that mean, peeling it back. So there's a lot of back and forth that went on here. Something was special about this is this was an Indigenous-led team. There were 5 of us who had to be involved in some of the days, but 3 of us who were myself and everybody else was Ojibwe who was involved with this. And it was a really magical space to engage with. what that looked like on the day was some art making. We got groups of youth and adults and elders to just draw and think about what joy looks like, what this means, to describe it to us from their perspective. And you can see lots of colorful images here. Some things I will kind of point out is for some of them, it was being able to be around a campfire and just hanging out. Some of it was the activities that they have done at Gidar camp that they do on a regular basis. And for some of them, it was being able to express all of these emotions. So there's actually a young person here who's crying because that enables them to experience multiple emotions at once. From there, what we did with this is we got each group to describe what was going on. What does this mean? What is in the picture? And then we created a whole bunch of sticky notes. All of these sticky notes were representations of every single part of a picture. So even if a picture had multiple parts, we described it. And every group got a set of sticky notes from all of the groups. From there, they were tasked to create their own kind of set or mind map of where sticky notes are, what they mean, why some are grouped together. They had a bit of time to do that independently. And then, excuse me, we asked them to tell us why. Why are you doing that? What does that mean? What does that look like? From there, we kind of had to jump off, have some time separately to create a model. This is what the final model looked like. As you can imagine, we had multiple iterations. We created something called a systems model. In the systems dynamics, sometimes you may have heard of something like a causal loop diagram, a stop and flow diagram. This is a simplistic form of a model that came from their perspective of what it means, what it looks like to experience joy at Gidar camp. I won't go into too much detail about this because people might want to hear different aspects, but what I will kind of outline here is how on the outside we have these things called universal drivers that impact everything that happens in this system. And what we saw in this is actually things that we see similar across all sorts of Indigenous groups, that sovereignty, this sense of connection or whakawhanaungatanga, and being engaged with the outdoors or the taiao were really important drivers of every single component in this system. Some of the key takeaways from this that I want to highlight is how this community, this group themselves, had a really strong understanding of what was required to live the good life. That's what they call this concept that's called Mino of the Wattsman. And the good life for them is the sense of well-being and, excuse me, it is the sense of well-being, the sense of flourishing in relationship with community. And I guess another important and beautiful component of this is that joy is something that's culturally oriented and multifaceted. It's not just one perspective, there are multiple things going on. So to kind of wrap all of this up and get to an understanding of what does this mean, what did we learn, what are the overarching takeaways from this work, there was kind of like the research side of things and then the outcomes, and then there's the relationship side of things. So I'll start with the research in itself. One of the main strongholds is that this mahi sought to really support and promote cultural revitalization, because not only is it a strong conduit to well-being, it actually activates multiple forms of these protective health outcomes. So we were looking at joy, but there would be multiple things that you could find within this group. Some other parts that might seem a little bit obvious but aren't discussed that much in the literature is that knowledge systems, so a tikanga, a kaua, a reo, a mata pono, are informed by this really strong relationship and interdependence with our natural environment. And then something that I guess I was really trying to find and experienced across many years is that joy is not only valuable, is it positive, but it's actually a necessary conduit to thriving well-being. We can't have well-being unless joy is involved to an extent. And now for the research relationship, this was the other kind of key investigator or kaimahi that I worked with who was from this community. This is Crystal Green Sky. We created this relationship that was built on reciprocity, and it took a lot of iteration, a lot of trying, a lot of figuring it out. And the way we kind of took on this research was utilizing both of our worldviews, both of our understandings of the world. And it was beautiful. And then in lots of ways, it was also really difficult because most of what we see out there is like a Māori, non-Māori, or an Indigenous, non-Indigenous model. And there's not really so much of a blueprint of how other groups who may have a parallel experience of colonization, for example, can interact. So sometimes we just had to try a little bit and then reflect on what was going on to see if that worked or not. And so a lot of what facilitated this was our long collaboration, because some projects are only months at a time. This was almost 2 years. I've already talked about that last part. So yeah, this was some of the most beautiful hua of our work. I'm gonna leave you there with that. There are some references, and I'm happy to share the slides with folks if they are interested, but I'm gonna stop sharing for now, allow for people to flow through with some questions and see if there are some things we can talk about.
Amazing, amazing, Dr. Hariata. Yeah, there are some cool things in there. I love how you've distinguished between calm joy, energetic joy. That's giving me kia kauea tātou te rehia vibes, and then kind of tā te tamariki, tāna mahi wawahi taha vibes. So I like how you've done that. That's awesome. I'm interested to hear what the good life is. And what that might look like within an Aotearoa setting. Loved the Indigenous humour quote. That's a gangster quote that I think will come through in other people's research in years to come. We did some mahi with our Oi sisters. This is a bit of a plug. We did a mahi with the Oi sisters around tākaro and te taitokero. And puku kata came out as a real glaringly loud, obvious insight around tākaro and what it looks like in that space. And they said it doesn't matter which iwi you go to or which part of the country you go to, you see that unique sense of banter. And that might look like within the homes, that might look like on the atia. And so that is another form or version of tākaro as well. So loving all of the kōrero so far. This is your time e te whānau to, chuck some pātai that you have into the chat, but I'll kick us off with one if possible. So what were some of the key insights and offerings shared through your cultural exchange with the Ojibwe community? And how might those contribute to or inspire Indigenous-led initiatives and expressions of joy here in Aotearoa?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll start by saying I started the PhD. I wanted to go and do this in America to try and learn about another iwi's perspective. I wanted to spend time learning about other challenges that they might experience, and with also a sense of responsibility to share some of the ways that Māori have overcome some of the challenges we have and some of the privileges we have as well that we're not always aware of. So I think some of the most valuable stuff was like kind of just going like this, just expanding the world a bit more. As I said before, there's not always like relationship between different Indigenous groups, especially like in such a long-standing way. Sometimes we meet for a hui, sometimes we have some like conferences, that type of thing, or mostly engage on Zoom. So being able to actually step into their space as manuhiri and finding ways to be helpful was something that was a really strong learning experience for me. And it allowed me at multiple times, and it wasn't always just in the research, like data collection time, right? Sometimes it was just hanging out, having those cup of tea moments where I was able to reflect on like, wow, this is so different. Like the way that they've taken this on, the way they look after their tamariki, for example, is so beautiful. And we do things, but they're not the same. So some of that was like a really valuable shifting, or I guess in lots of ways expanding of my mind. There were times where I haven't spent so much time with lakes, because I'm not a big lake iwi person as well. And so learning about what was important to them. Some other components were like, this is really close to the Canadian border. The winters were crazy. The winters were so cold, sometimes like minus 30 something in the winter. And so learning how for them this is normal, this is a part of their ways of knowing, were really valuable. It helped kind of shape a different worldview. And so I saw resilience, I saw joy, I saw ways in which even the youngest rangatahi really loved their natural environment. Some other things I think I learned from this process was how when you can find a way to be a part of a community, be a part of their own wānanga, their own system, it takes a lot of humility. You have to kind of sit there and just be willing to sit wahangu, to be, you know, the manuhiri in times that I don't think we always get to do that. Sometimes we kind of just jump in and do the doing. So being able to find ways to do that with respect, yeah, taught me something different.
Amazing, amazing. We've got some things coming through the chat that I think we can have a little look at. Kia ora takuta Hariata. What was your reasoning for undertaking this particular rangahau, and how will you utilise it this learning moving forward? Hopefully in Aotearoa, just plug.
There were like multiple reasons. One big part was my advisor was Ojibwe, and so I wanted to try and work with her iwi in ways. I wanted to try and facilitate some of the relationship building through their connections, because it does take a lot of time, and I only really had 2 years. Some of it was that I was really trying to engage with a group that already exists, because sometimes in research we try to gather, you know, we try to gather whānau together, but the actual logistics of that's really difficult. And then being able to compare different social settings is not always the same if they're their own unique whānau. So if there's a reason why they're already connecting, I can go there, I can go to this thing, I can try and tack on side by side. So that's kind of why I connected with that group. When it came to joy in itself, I really wanted to, as like a political statement, engage in something that was positive. Because a lot of what public health does is try to mitigate risk, to try and understand the mechanisms of a health problem and to change that. So I wanted to find a way to amplify a positive thing. And I was in relationship with communities saying, hey, if you want a quantitative expert, I'm not going to be that person. I am a really strongly trained qualitative person. So that means I can get to depth. I can get to concepts. What are some things you want to understand? And I actually spent a lot of time thinking it would be gratitude, because they have a lot of gratitude practices. But this is kind of how it came out. But after each wānanga, they would have a little hui for the teachers to kind of debrief what happened at camp. And that was when I would have these discussions with the kuia who are still involved with the kaiako, to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking, what do you think? So there was, almost a year of the back and forth before we even started the research.
Right. And that's the important part, eh? We all know that in terms of establishing and building, maintaining those relationships. There's another partai in here which leans into the taonga pūoro aspect from Thea. So did whānau you were speaking and studying with speak about how pūoro and waiata fare as a way of grounding in culture and community?
So an interesting thing about the drumming that I shared about before is this is like really solely a tāne responsibility. Right. So there are drumming groups, and that was something like I could have tried to engage with them, but it was only going to be tāne. And so it was interesting in that it wasn't the sole focus of this. It was something that happened. Sometimes we went to powwows as a part of camp. Sometimes we had people come in and do some drumming. Some of the rangatahi or the youth were drummers themselves. But there were also aspects of this community who were still trying to reconnect. Very few of them could speak their reo fluently, and some had parents who hadn't grown up with access to a lot of these practices as well. So some of it was actually about broaching relationship in its first instance, but it's kind of like a part of the fabric. Like, this was one thing that they would do, but it wasn't the only thing. And one really beautiful aspect I got to be involved with was actually something that a part of our project was getting the youth prepared to go to a powwow. There was an annual winter powwow, so they were getting them geared up with their regalia, because lots of them don't have access to that, an understanding of how to kanikani, how to dance in this space. And they had a kaumātua actually bless all of their taonga for the first time dancing in it. So some of it's about building that relationship with that tikanga or that mahinga that they haven't done for generations.
And do you think that there's any like alignment with some of the practices in tikanga here? Like, can you think of any, maybe in using that example, that kind of have real close transfer?
Yeah, for sure. I think the main thing I saw is that different things get different people, right? Some people are really sporty, and so they're playing Bagarawaiwan, or what you might know as lacrosse, and that brought people in. They loved the physicality of it. They loved playing this game, and that helped them to connect to their Ojibwe tanga in certain ways. Some of them were really into the drumming, and they would do that. Another important kind of activity is beading or creating beautiful artworks, and this is an example of one. And I'll show it closer. They made it as like a model of a tanga that I have, which is really beautiful.
Like a haumata.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so I did see that, like, yeah, there were different things that drew people in, and we see that back home as well, right? Some people are very scared to go to their first real Māori class. That feels like there's a lot of trauma involved. It feels like it's a really taumaha or heavy thing to do, but they become kapahaka nuts. Like, they're totally involved. They love that activity, and their whole whānau kind of will get in. And so I guess one important thing we see is that you need to have multiple levels of hierarchy, or you need to have ways that people can engage with their culture at different levels, because it's not going to be one thing that gets everybody.
Yeah, right. I love that. Can I rewind back to maybe that first whakatauki, kia kawea tātou te rehia, I think the whole one, e te rehia, e te harikoa, e te mataraharaha. Like, so let us be taken by the pursuits of joy, entertainment, play. Did any of your findings, you think, and I mean, humans probably coming really loudly at me right now, but reveal any insights that align with or reflect the essence of that whakatauki and that real unique te ao Māori view of joy?
Like, yes and no. There were some things that were much more subtle, because the hard thing is, like, you see it, you have experiences with it, but you can't make people, you can't make the data emerge in certain ways. And so something I really expected to see, actually, because we would play Bagarawaiwan basically all year except for winter, would be playing lacrosse. I expected there to be like more discussions that came out about that, ways in which going to a powwow was really fun or meaningful. And some of those things just didn't come about, and you can't always like control for that. But the discussion of joy and then the humor kind of spurred on quite a few other things after that were really fun. And like the quote that I shared, the exciting part after that is that they also talked about this way that you can kind of create a moment, I guess, around something silly that happened. And that day we'd been playing a game outside, and someone like slipped over, and everybody laughed about it, and everybody had a fun time about it. And so I guess the humor side, or the having fun, is something that I wanted to highlight, because it is actually not that serious. It's not something that you would necessarily think to put time into, a curriculum, but I think it highlights that you need things that facilitate that, like whakawhanaungatanga, like times where youth actually had to get told to be off their cell phones, because sometimes they would miss these moments, these connections that would happen. And so I think some of what's valuable about that is sometimes we can only create a stage for something to happen, and from there the magic has to be itself. And I wish I had seen a lot more kind of discussions around play or activity. And something that was really implicit, I guess, like not so obvious that people love the most, was doing an art activity, being there like by their mates, doing something side by side, but it was more like a parallel play type of thing. They weren't necessarily interacting, but the banter going on, the being able to chat or chirp their friend, like, hey, remember you did that thing? This was like something really important to them that they really loved, and I didn't expect that to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And there's distinct ways that happen, iwi, hapu, whānau, up and down the country. I want to talk around pūrākau. So the mahi is giving off a lot of synergies to the whare tapere and all of the types of activities that we engage in within the whare tapere. Taonga pūoro, kapahaka, taonga tākaro, mahi a te rehia, our arts, our adornments, karetao. And so, yeah, I just wonder whether there were pūrākau that were unlocked throughout your experiences with the Ojibwe community.
Yeah, there were kaumātua who had come most times. They were like the resident ones, and they didn't actually do so much teaching. Their role was more like to facilitate the integration of knowledge. When they were getting like a new lesson, they'd say, okay, like say this was something that's more considered Western science. What does that mean for us from our Ojibwe perspective? And then there were other elders who would come in, and their point was like to share a story. And they were like hilarious. They were hātakihi as. There were some times that they were not necessarily like child appropriate. And there are all sorts of moments that I kind of was like, okay, like what's the point here? Or what does this mean? But their ability to tie it into the mahinga kai, for example, things that were going on were brilliant. And so one beautiful example is that one of the kōrero had brought out and created a wātaka, or like a physical calendar to help build understanding of the kupu, the knowledge, but to describe why they have 13 moons, because they like hold on to that tightly. And they have these names for the moons similar to us that they all mean something. They indicate something that's going on. And so one example was at the end of winter, it's the time that the bears would be waking up out of hibernation. So they had a lot of stories about bears and what that means and what's going on. And then they'd have like stronger connections after that, because some of the youth would be bear clan, and so they'd have to understand what was the meaning. So there were these beautiful like connection points that kept going on and kept happening. And so some of them that were like the most fun or engaging for me were this game called Snow Snake, which is it's like a pole that's varnished and usually painted to look like a snake. And they'd make this thing that's like a tunnel, kind of like if you've seen a bobsled, you'd make one out of the ice and you'd throw your snakes down that. But there was this whole process, because we had spent a year, we went and cultivated these logs, we finished them, like completely stripped them down, varnished them, and then painted them. So it allowed like not only this understanding of like the environmental aspect, the practical activity, and the artwork. There's also a whole bunch of kōrero going on about why that's important, how that's like a form of kurutao, really, a form of an underarm throw, and what was the point of it. So being able to culminate over this, like, was a year-long project, being able to go on and then play it was beautiful in multiple ways, even though folks who would have just come for that one would have just played with some sticks and a luge. But it was beautiful. There are lots of ways that we do this stuff at home as well, learning about the different aspects of kiorahi. We learn the pūrākau, we learn how to make it, right, and then we learn how to play it. And it taught me that from their perspective, and I think I hadn't connected this in my own worldview, it's important to keep sharing these stories. They have to keep going over and over again, because the point is that you would get different tikanga or understanding different points in your life. And so the Gida grandmas would be like, we need to share the story again. We need to share about it differently, or get somebody else to share it from their perspective, because there will be continually things that they can gather out of this, especially these like seasonally dependent stories, like about the makua or the bear.
I love that. I love that. It gives permission for the evolution of the kemu, of the taonga tuku iho, of the kōrero tuku iho, and it really puts the taonga into the tākaro. Like, I love that part. There's one other partai, and then I've got some final things. Oh, are we going to get to it? 4 minutes. 4 minutes, Hariata, like maybe 2 minutes to answer. So this is from Rob Gambalotti. Hey, Rob. Rob's from the States. I've seen a lot of organized lacrosse in the US university system. Was the lacrosse played in the camps more informal, multi-generational, or much adult influence?
So we actually had like a tohunga who was a lacrosse player who knew everything from making lacrosse sticks through to how to teach it. And for, I think there was about 4 months that he came every month. So he taught about different kupu on how to say, how to start, how to do different moves. He taught all sorts of aspects of lacrosse, and then would play. And so the playing itself was mostly informal, I'd say, because the point was to get everybody to play. If you had too many rules, if you had too many good players mixed in, you wouldn't have everybody involved. And obviously not every time people were doing it, but there were some of the youth who played on a team. It was more formal. And I'd say something that was surprising is the adults still went really hard. The adults didn't just like let them roll. But you get your first point. If you're about to make it, people won't just sabotage that because they're 11 and you're 26. But they would rough them up. They wouldn't just let the youngins kind of go easy. And I thought this was like a pretty interesting contrast from what you'd see sometimes in Western, like traditional teaching of sports in a school system. No, they're like, okay, you know how to play, let's go.
Wow. What a cool way to kick off our post-matariki time of the year, time of the season. But yeah, just e mihi ana kia koe, kei te māreikura o Ngāti Haua, o Ngāti Māhanga e Hariata, tēnei mātou o toi tangata e tuku ana i ngā aroha kia koe. E kore e mimiti te puna mihi mo tō whai wāhi ki te Wānanga tahi, kua hihi ko te ao i o kōrero, kua rongo hoki, te ngākau i tō ihi, tō wehi, tō mana. Nō reira e te uri o ngā wai tuki kiri o Waikato, nei rā te reo tuku mihi, te reo aroha, te reo maioha kia koe, mihi ana.